Hi everybody. I'm going to talk today a little bit about strategy, a little bit about the role of strategy, a little bit about what you can expect to really enjoy in that role, and maybe some of the things that are also a little bit challenging in that role, because it's not all fun and games. So I've called it the strategist choice, and I think for me it is very much a choice. Obviously it's something you're going to choose to study and obviously choose to go in a career in. But it's also something that gives you a huge amount of choice in your own career, and what you can explore in that, what you can do, and actually how you can further a lot of things of your own knowledge and your own career, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit. But first of all, obviously, who am I? My name is Jonty Fisher. I'm a Senior Vice President at Publicis Group Africa, and I've had about 22 years experience of running strategy both in independence and at a network. And I've been lucky to work on some really great brands in my career, and some of that is what we can obviously talk about today in the strategy role. So, I think I often get the question, well, isn't everything strategy? And strategy is an incredibly broad term. I mean, there's so many different facets of strategy. There's all the way from business strategy all the way down into more of our world, into marketing strategy, into brand strategy, content strategy. There's so much. So what is that? And I think we've got to start broad before we start drilling down. And I think to get us started on that, let's just talk about the most basic idea of what strategy is. And strategy ultimately is about making an informed opinion about how to win. That great definition from Mark Pollard there. And I think ultimately strategy is about creating change. And if you want to create change, you've got to have a plan to be able to do that. You've got to have a framework for how you're going to make decisions, how you're going to decide on which actions to take, how you're going to split budgets, how you're going to decide on which tactics you're going to do. All of that is effectively strategy and the kind of choices that we need to make. If we drill that down a little bit more into our world and cribbing this from straight from red and yellow, for me, strategy is the absolute true intersection between logic and magic. You've got to have the magic of the creative mind. You've got to be able to understand that our job is to try and find the most creative solutions, but you've obviously got to have a lot of guardrails in that, and that's where the logic comes in. You've got to understand commerciality. You've got to understand the client. You've got to understand the category. You've got to understand their business very well. And in putting those two things together, what you find in the middle is really what a great strategist does and what they're able to do. And ultimately, and I'm using the term broadly here in advertising, but ultimately it's what separates advertising from art. I would love to be able to let my creative colleagues run absolutely wild and do whatever they want to do, but we'll end up with a beautiful art gallery a lot of the time, which is amazing, but not necessarily what we get paid to do as effectively a business service, right? That's what we are in our industry. So what does that actually give us? Well, in agencies, it's really about creating the ground for the most creative solutions to a problem. And you've got to look at that through fundamentally a couple of different layers. And I'll talk about this as three things, as being the voice of the consumer, the mind of the client, and the heart of the creative. And what's really interesting about this is that you end up having to fight different battles in your role as a strategist. And very often, you might be having a conversation with the creative team where you've got to really fight for the voice of the consumer in it. Sometimes you're having a conversation with a client where you've got to really fight for the heart of the creative. You've got to fight for the work. So all of these three aspects are incredibly important in your role as a strategist and how you're going to take that forward. So you've got to be a lot of different things a lot of the time. You've got to be a pathfinder, you've got to be a truth teller, you've got to be an anthropologist a lot of the time, you've got to be a client whisperer a huge amount of the time. You've got to be a heartbreaker, so very often you've got to break creative hearts, and that's the tough part of the job because those are your colleagues and people that you're in the trenches with. You've got to be a psychologist, you've got to very often be a Pied Piper. You've got to sell a hell of a lot of work and sell a hell of a lot of ideas. So if we kind of really try and fundamentally say, what are the building blocks of strategy, and particularly when we're talking about an agency type environment? Well, ultimately, probably what you're going to be learning at Red and Yellow, and certainly what in the first kind of couple of years of your careers, you're going to be following this type of flow in various different forms. So really getting a brief from the client. This is what the client wants to achieve. What you've got to do then is to take that and really try and articulate what the problem is in there. And that's the really hard part, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Then you've got to find insights. There's no great strategy that can happen without insight. And once you've got that insight, you can start developing a strategy. You can say, we're trying to achieve this, we want to get to here, And how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by doing something. It's going to give you an approach, those guidelines of how we're actually going to solve this problem. And then you're going to get a proposition or a core strategic idea out of that. So, think about Dove Real Beauty, or think about Nike. Everybody's an athlete. So if you've got a body, you're an athlete. So that's going to give you a core strategic idea that you've then got to roll out in a number of different ways. And that might end up in a content strategy, that might end up in a digital strategy, it might end up in the creative execution of the work, it might end up in an activations piece, whatever that is. What is that experience that you're trying to create for the customer or the consumer in that space, and how are you actually going to solve the problem? There's a whole lot of planning that goes into that as well. And then obviously during that work and during that execution, you're going to be measuring and optimizing as you go. And at the end of that, if it's a campaign, if it's got a limited time, you're going to be measuring that and saying, what do we learn out of that? And how can we shift and change what we do next time? So that ongoing optimization is absolutely part of a strategist role as well. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts, but I think it's much more interesting to talk about, I suppose, what does it feel like? What does it look like on a day-to-day basis? And, I'm a strategist, so we're going to obviously have some graphs and diagrams here, but to start with, I think the majority of your time is spent in brainstorming and research. So reviewing work, brainstorming with execution teams, and doing a lot of research, and I'll unpack that a bit in a second. Big part of the job is about actually how you sell your work. So building strategy decks is like an absolutely core key function of what you need to be able to do, and you've actually got to treat those decks like pieces of art. I always say if you want to try and sell something, make it beautiful, and you've got to be able to do that really well. Campaign analysis, writing briefs and actually briefing teams and client meetings are a big part of your day as well. And I put that last sliver in there about thinking about words, and I'm going to talk about that a bit as well. But words absolutely are the currency of a strategist. And there's at least 5% of my day, of any day, is thinking about words. Because words carry so much in a strategist's life, and you've got to be able to distill very complex information into very simple things, and you do that by words. And it seems weird to see that on a slide, but really that's actually very much part of your day, and it's very true. But if we have to break that down into, or talk about that, maybe bring that to life in a bit more of a different way, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about maybe what are some of those core skill sets that you need as a strategist, and what are the things that are really amazing about the role? What actually further you as a human being as well? Because that's why we all want to work and why we all want to study as well. So it's important to talk about that. And the first thing is this idea that one of my partners a while ago, Kelly Putter, and myself coined as beautiful problems. And I think this is such a fundamental part of every strategist's job. And a lot of people, I think, overlook the importance of this and actually the depth of this. And the way we speak about it is that you've got to actually love problems so much. You've got to spend so much time with problems and being able to articulate problems that you find them beautiful. So an absolutely fundamental core part of a strategist's role is to solve beautiful problems. And, if you think about it, the only way we can actually get to the right solution is if we can really figure out as a strategist what that problem is and what the right problem is. There's lots of problems you can solve behind any brief. What's the right problem, and what's the how you're actually going to unlock that problem? That's about articulation. That's about articulating a problem in a way that is very simple for anybody that's working on that, including yourself, because very often you need to remind yourself. Anybody who's working on that can really, really understand what we're trying to do, because you've got to be able to look through any piece of work and see what problem it's trying to solve, and be able to evaluate and say, yes, this is actually going to solve that problem. So the idea of solving beautiful problems is absolutely fundamental to a strategist role. And there's a couple of things about how you do that. And the first one is learning how to think rather than what to think. And I think that's a big part of why you would come to something like Red and Yellow, is actually to learn how to think, not what to think. You can go on the internet and you can learn about strategy as much as you want. You can read case studies of great strategy pieces that have done, and you can see all the building blocks. But ultimately, for you've got to be able to learn how to think. And that's something that is fundamentally different. It's something that never stops. I spent all of my time, all day long, thinking about how to unlearn what I've learned and understand what I don't know and challenge my own thinking and challenge endemic thinking that's out there. And the only way you can really do that is if you actually have the courage to do that and to ask the dumb questions. And there's the guys at Eat Big Fish, which is one of the big consultancies around challenger brands, they talk about the idea of intelligent naivety. And really, great strategists don't want to be the smartest people in the room. They want to be the people that are asking the right questions, and very often those are the dumb questions. And the reason why is that they're actually not dumb questions, because if you want to change rote thinking, if you want to really challenge the status quo, and you want to break new ground, you want to find new paths, you've got to do that by almost challenging all of your dogma and all of your endemic thinking. And the way to do that is to get to the absolute root and ask some really stupid questions that you think are stupid questions. So in that way, arrogance and ego really are the enemy of the great creative work, but they're also the enemy of great strategic work. So I think that understanding in terms of the role is really important, and I think it's something that's really exciting in terms of taking this as a career choice. The idea of actually being able to learn how to think is a fundamental thing in strategy. And I say as well, connecting disparate dots is our superpower, and we'll talk about this quite a bit, but the idea of strategy, as it is in creativity, is you've got to assimilate huge amounts of information, and you've got to be like a magpie that's picking up all these shiny objects along your career and actually being able to draw on those and pull those back together and putting things back together in fresh ways, which is really exciting. So you've got to do that by asking dumb questions, and you've also got to do that by asking provocative questions. And I think one of the skills, as much as learning how to think, is actually learning how to ask the right questions, and to have what are those questions that you've got to be thinking about to be able to get to the root cause of a problem. And that's a skill. And that's something, again, that's very hard to learn just by reading something on the internet or by researching it yourself. It's a way of being trained about how to think and how to actually approach a problem. And the idea of the beginner's mindset is effectively that. It's that idea of intelligent naivety, that idea of constantly challenging your work. And I think that's the awesome thing about strategy, is you never stop learning. You go into such a wide variety of fields, and you go into them with depth. You've got to be able to have a lot of depth of how you understand different problems in different categories and different clients. And so there's this constant learning and constant unlearning and constant learning, which I love about the role. The second big thing is around unearthing honest truths. And I think, as I said at the beginning when we were going through that flow, insight is everything to a strategist. And being able to really understand what an insight is, it's very, very simple to write a definition down of insights, but there's a huge amount of unspoken words about what it really defines an insight, what actually defines a leverageable, fresh piece of information that you can actually turn into actions and interest and work and make something really compelling. And there's a whole lot of different aspects you've got to be looking at that when you're trying to find a strategic proposition, when you're trying to write a brief, all those types of elements. You've got to be looking at category insights, or category truths. You've got to be looking obviously at the human truths, at your consumers and what they really are doing and feeling and thinking, and all of those different aspects around the human truth. You've got to be looking at obviously the brand truth, the brand itself. You've got to be looking at the category. You've got to be looking at culture. And there's truths that are in all of those spaces. And understanding which one of those are leverageable, which one of those you can actually turn into action, turn into something that's compelling and will actually move people and drive them to change, is one of the key skills of a strategist. But also that's fascinating, right? Because you are constantly exploring at great depth all sorts of different fields. And your understanding of the human condition and understanding of the world and understanding of our place in the world is something, if that's something that drives you, then this is absolutely what you should be doing, because it's kind of a fundamental part of what we do. And ultimately to what end? So ultimately our role is to really unleash relevant creativity. And as I said before, creativity in and of itself is art. Creativity that's applied against a problem, applied to be able to solve something that has commercial benefit in the end or societal benefit in the end, is obviously what we need to be focused on as strategists, is what guardrails that we put in place to make sure that we're actually solving those problems. So the idea of unleashing relevant creativity is at the heart of what we do, and it's our purpose as I suppose as strategists. It's what we are here to do, is to work with teams. And there's no great work that gets done without great strategy. Some people may argue with that, but I certainly do believe that. And I think the best work that I've ever been able to do in my career has always been from a real true partnership with a creative partner, that we've been able to work kind of in each other's pockets and think similarly and challenge each other and have that mutual respect where we're really challenging each other's thinking and continually pulling it back to the problem. And in that way, you get this really sense of relevant creativity that really drives impact and solves problems. But probably one of the things that I love most about this role is this idea of creating a stream of interestingness. And that seems like a very weird thing to say, but if you want to be great in this role, you've got to have an absolutely voracious appetite for knowledge and an absolutely voracious appetite for understanding how things work, how people work, how businesses work, how societies work, how cultures work, what are the drivers there, what are the barriers to change, all of those elements. And to do that, you've got to have such a broad approach in how you actually assimilate knowledge and how you use that. Because I can't tell you how many times I would have listened to a podcast about the most obscure thing in the world, but lo and behold, 9 months later, I'm working on a piece of business, and I'll remember something from there that I'll pull into the strategy, and it's actually something that unlocks the whole thing and gives you a completely fresh way of thinking of something. So being able to read absolutely voraciously, to listen absolutely voraciously, to watch absolutely voraciously, to get out there into the world instead of trying to do everything on the internet. If you're working with a retail partner, get out there, go and spend a Saturday and spend half a day in there just watching and observing and sitting. That old thing, a desk is a very dangerous place to view the world. But ultimately what that gives you is you become very interesting. I'm not saying I'm just saying a strategist. You generally can become very interesting people because you are so broad in your reach of your knowledge. And that's such an important foundational element to be able to pull. So if you're somebody that likes that, if you're somebody that is curious about the world, if you're somebody that's interested in knowledge and is kind of in that space of always learning, then this is 100% the role for you. And this is where I think strategy gives back so much to you as a person as well, because it allows you to develop and build so much knowledge. And one of the key things I think is that every conversation is a sale in this role. And I touched on this at the beginning, but you're constantly having to sell internally, externally. You're constantly selling ideas. You're constantly selling a point of view. And in that selling, you're challenging yourself. You're checking how robust that is, and you're getting feedback. But everything is about the sale. So what I said right at the beginning about building decks, you've got to really hone your ability to get across an idea. You've got to hone your ability to be able to motivate people and convince them of something, of your point of view. And you generally end up writing, rewriting, distilling things down and making sure that you're able to get your points across in a very, very powerful way. And that's, again, another big part of this role, and something that, if that's something that interests you, is a very big part of this role. But it's a real skill to hone. And again, somewhere like Red and Yellow will help you to hone that skill, but it's a never-ending challenge and a never-ending battle. It's something that you'll be doing your whole career. And I think often, because the reason why this is so important is the strategy can often be quite a solitary role in an agency. Agencies don't hire a lot of strategists. A lot of different companies, whether it's an agency or any other communications business, they don't hire a lot of strategists. You'll often be in a very small team. You'll often be outnumbered by a creative team that really wants to fight for an idea. And you've got to be able to hold up your end. You've got to be able to uphold that voice of the consumer. You've got to be able to uphold that voice of the client in that conversation. So that constant selling is really important in this role. And the kind of courage and the confidence to be able to do that is incredibly important. And I said this at the beginning, but words very much are our currency. And words can carry so much. They carry so much nuance. They carry so much of the kind of nous of what we're trying to get across. They carry emotion. They carry, words can be a fire, words can be peace, words can be so much, and they carry so much. And the discipline of choosing less words and understanding which words are right is such a big part of a strategist's role. So again, if this is something that appeals to you, and the idea of being a bit of a wordsmith, but being able to really have to apply your mind as well, I think this is a kind of a classic part of the role, which is often overlooked. I think often with young strategists, I spend the most amount of time just tending to go back and make it shorter. And I think at school and university, we tend to get taught verbosity. We tend to get taught to write reams of stuff. And strategy is all about distillation. There's that old Mark Twain thing where he said, I'm writing you a long letter because I didn't have time to write you a short one. That's exactly that. simplicity is incredibly hard. It's incredibly hard. Complexity is often very easy, because you can just capture everything down. Strategy is about choice. Strategy is about discipline. It's about sacrifice, and it's about distilling things down. And that's, very often, I think, when we think about what is the difficult part of the strategy role, I think the difficulty part is that you often can feel really overwhelmed. There's so much information out there, especially nowadays. There's so much access to varying information these days. If you go on the internet, you can find a million different points of view, and you can find something to back up any kind of confirmation bias that you need. And the difficulty is actually being able to take all of that information and assimilate it and distill it down into something that's simple to understand for the people that need to work on this with you, something that's simple for a consumer to understand, or the person that you need to move or to change their behavior. But that distillation down into something that's simple is one of the most fundamental things that you've got to be able to do as a strategist, and it's the hardest thing. And it seems really simple now, but what you start unpacking as you get more experienced in your strategy journey is that what you thought was simple then is actually not simple. And what you thought was the right expression that you made simple was actually maybe not the best reflection. And you start to understand your own biases, and you start to understand all the biases that are out there that maybe drive you into a certain direction, that if you really want to create new paths, if you really want to challenge the status quo and do things differently, you've actually got to rewire everything that you're thinking and redistill it. And this constant learning, constant change, constant reinterpretation of what you know, I think is one of the most interesting and intriguing parts of the strategy role. So I suppose in starting to wrap up, I think if you have doubts about what strategy is, I would just say do it, just explore it, because I think there's so much that you can do with a strategy career and a strategy background, because everything really is strategy, right? There's every different career, every pocket, this sets you up for so much. Critical thinking is one of those, call it a 27th century skill, I don't know, before the robots take over. But ultimately, strategists are the people that are going to be able to win in any future world, because you're constantly changing and adapting what you know, because you've got critical thinking as your backbone. And that ability to do that, I think, is a real future-proofing type of skill. So I would say dive in. If this is something you want to follow, dive in. And I don't say this is a very trite thing, but I say this in that, yes, when you start in your career, the world awaits you, absolutely. But I think it's so much more profound in strategy, because you're exploring the world so much more than you do in so many other roles. And I think that, for me, is what's profound, what's meaningful about strategy as not just a career, but as a pastime as well. And that ability to take critical thinking and the ability to really explore the world and understand where we fit in the world, I think, is what strategy gives back to you as a person. And I think that's really powerful and really profound, and something that I've always taken a huge amount of kind of solace for in this role, because it can be hard sometimes, but it gives so much back to you, and I think that's immensely powerful. So that's a deep dive into strategy. So thank you for your time.